When it seemed all doors of hope had closed, a miracle happened. Trang woke up, a life reclaimed through tears, effort, and silent sacrifices. But just as the light flickers, darkness moves quietly. Tu Tieu, Yuri, Egan, and Balan, those who seemed to have escaped danger, don't yet know that. Another hand is silently watching them. Today's story doesn't end with laughter. It softly warns. Don't be quick to believe peace has come when the truth remains hidden. Early morning light filtered weakly through the old curtain, casting pale streaks across the damp little room. The scent of freshly boiled herbs lingered in the air. Tu Tieu sat silently beside the bed, her eyes fixed on the pale, unconscious face of Trang. In her hand, a warm cloth moved gently across her friend's forehead, a motion repeated endlessly over many days. In a corner, Ba Lan quietly poured the dark medicine into a chipped porcelain bowl. Her hands trembled faintly, but her movements remained precise. No words were spoken. Time itself seemed suspended in the thick fog of uncertainty. Tu Tieu took the bowl and carefully brought it to Trang's lips, trying to coax each bitter spoonful in. Trang's breathing was uneven, sometimes shallow, sometimes strained. With every slight twitch of her brows, Tu Tieu's heart contracted. She set the bowl down and gripped Trang's fragile hand tightly, as if trying to pass on a spark of warmth, of life, to pull her back from the edge. Outside, the wind stirred through the unfinished trellis in the yard, rustling vines that had yet to climb. The sky hung low and gray, as if warning of a storm not only in the weather, but in fate itself. A storm that was gathering force, preparing to crash down and tear apart whatever peace still remained in their fragile world. Tu Tieu stepped out of the small house, a knife in hand, her footsteps quiet as she descended the damp slope behind the garden. No words, no sighs, just the slow, steady rhythm of someone carrying an unseen weight. She reached the old bamboo grove Balan had once mentioned, crouched down, and began cutting slender stalks, just enough to build the trellis for the gourds Trang once dreamed of planting. Each chop of the knife echoed in the cool wind that slipped through her hair, across her skin, and into her chest. Her face showed no signs of fatigue, only quiet determination, the kind born of someone trying to preserve normalcy in a world edging toward collapse. She returned home and began lashing the bamboo to wooden stakes. Her rough hands tied each knot with care. Slowly, a simple trellis took shape in front of the porch. Inside, Ba Lan continued tending to Trang, like a silent ritual clinging to hope. Two parallel worlds straining to stay connected. Tu Tieu looked up. The sky had turned a heavy gray, the kind that threatened rain. She paused, motionless. Standing in the half-finished garden, a flicker crossed her eyes, something shifting like the tremor before a landslide. It wasn't just worry for Trang, it was a sense, a quiet but growing certainty that something was slipping away, or perhaps about to be exposed. Rain clouds thickened. Inside the old house, Ba Lan rummaged through Trang's worn coat. Her eyes moved restlessly. Suspicion, worry, and a flicker of fear danced across her face. The USB that once lay tucked in that pocket was gone. A tiny rip in the lining held only silence, Elsewhere, a phone call pierced the calm, cold and sharp. A man's voice issued a command. Retrieve the USB at all costs. What it held must never be exposed. He pressed harder. Check Tu Tieu's belongings and her friends. Trust no one. Balan hesitated, then lowered her gaze in reluctant agreement. Tu Tieu returned from the bamboo grove, clothes stained with mud and effort. She didn't know she was being watched. As she set down the stalks and resumed tying the trellis, a shadow flickered behind the fence, half hidden, silent, waiting. In the stillness of the yard, tension began to coil like an invisible wire. Ba Lan glanced toward Tu Tieu, her gaze uncertain, caught between loyalty and betrayal. Her hands continued rinsing the herbal bowl, but her mind churned like a storm. No one knew where the USB had gone, but its contents were clearly dangerous, and it was no longer just about Trang. That small device had opened a doorway, one that now invited hidden glances, whispered commands, and silent threats, all creeping toward Tu Tieu, who remained unaware of the darkness about to touch her world. A spacious office, silent and sleek, bathed in cold white light that highlighted every detail of its luxury. The door swung open. A young man stepped in, his eyes burning with restrained fury. Behind the desk, an older man didn't look up, his focus buried in a thick file. Tension stretched tight in the quiet. No greeting, no preamble. The son dropped a photograph onto the desk. It showed Tu Tieu tending to an unconscious patient. His voice cut like a blade. "Why are you having her followed?" The father slowly lifted his head. His gaze was ice. He stated flatly, "The USB must be recovered, no matter the method." But at the mention that Tu Tieu once saved his son's life after a vicious ambush, he hesitated, just for a moment. The young man stood his ground, unflinching. He didn't plead. He issued a warning. If his father harmed her, he would sever all ties. No family, no blood. A heavy silence fell. For the first time, the father's gaze wavered. Then, without a word, he looked away and gave a small nod. Not in agreement, but in reluctant acknowledgement that he had lost this silent battle. The young man turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. Alone, the father sat motionless, his expression unreadable. But his mind turned, calculating. The game wasn't over. It had only changed direction. The room was sealed tight, a long wooden table coated in a fine layer of dust. At its head sat Mr. Tuan, his sharp eyes fixed on the three figures who had just entered. Yuri, Egan, and a silent young woman placed a bag of money on the table. Every move careful, calculated. Inside the bag was the full compensation, payment for breaking a contract. Money scraped together quietly, desperately, to protect Egan's name and life. No one sat, no one smiled. The air hung thick and tense. Egan slid a prepared document across the table, requesting a signed acknowledgement of receipt. Mr. Tuan skimmed it, lips curling, half smirk, half scorn. Time dragged, a thread pulled too tight. Uri's grip tightened on the bag strap, her gaze never leaving his face. The young woman stood quiet beside them, her head bowed, but in her eyes a silent storm churned. At last, Mr. Tuan picked up the pen and signed. Before the ink had dried, Egan retrieved the paper, eyes locking with the older man's, as if to say, "We owe you nothing now." The three turned and walked out, their shadows blurring behind dust-streaked glass. Back inside, Mr. Tuan took a slow sip of tea, his expression unreadable, as though what he'd just lost wasn't money, but leverage. Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the old wooden window, drawing flickering lines across the floor. The air inside felt lighter. No more heavy scent of boiling herbs, only dried grass and the soft breeze of early autumn. Tu Tieu stood by the shelf, rearranging bottles of medicine. Her eyes were tired, her hands steady. Then, behind her, a faint sound, barely a whisper. A breath, a sigh. She froze. Slowly she turned. Trang moved. Just a flicker, a flutter of the eyelids, but it pierced Tu Tieu's heart like an arrow. She rushed to the bedside, hands trembling as they touched her friend's shoulder. Trang's eyes opened, slowly but fully. Her lips parted. No words yet, but her gaze was lucid. Balan rushed in, tears spilling the instant she saw. No one spoke. There were only gasps, muffled sobs, and the soundless rush of joy that flooded the room. Tu Tieu stepped outside, pulled out her phone, and called. On the other end, Egan stood still, speechless. Uri, standing nearby, blinked in disbelief. The woman beside them reached out, gently squeezing Egan's hand, as if to confirm that, yes, this was real. In a world still shadowed by secrets and fear, this was the first moment in a long while that resembled a miracle. And no one wanted it to end. Night settled slowly, like a veil of smoke over the old house. Inside, Trang slept soundly, her face finally at peace. Tu Tieu sat beside her, her gaze softer now, but somewhere deep inside, unease still lingered. She stepped out into the yard. The night breeze ran through her hair. On the new trellis, tender vines had begun to reach upward. It was a rare, quiet beauty, but not enough to silence the unease creeping beneath her skin. Elsewhere, the father, the man behind the surveillance, sat alone in a dimly lit room. Before him, a photo of the missing USB and a network diagram. He stared in silence, fingers grazing the same picture of Tu Tieu his son once threw at him. At a nearby desk, a stranger reviewed a list of personal items recovered from Tu Tieu's home. His eyes were sharp, methodical, noting every detail. They hadn't found the USB, but they weren't done looking. Back in the small kitchen, Ba Lan quietly washed the dishes. Her hands trembled faintly. Tu Tieu entered, offering a soft smile, unaware that from the shadows someone was watching. Not obviously, but deliberately. Outside, rain began to fall, silent, unannounced. There was no thunder, but the real storm had just begun.